Hello everybody, Luis here and let's talk C Sharp. So today we'll talk about for loops, and we know what loops are and what they do, especially if you've watched my last video on do while loops. You know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, that's not a problem. It is enough to know that loops are control structures that we use in the code so that we can repeat a piece of code over and over again a number of times, right? Sometimes we don't know exactly the number of times we'll need to run that code. For those situations, it is probably a good idea to go with while loops. There are times, however, that we know exactly the number of times that we need that code to run. So for those situations, it is most likely a good idea to go with for loops. Of course, this is just a rule of thumb. So it's not set in stone. The correct answer is to which loop to use in each situation actually depends on the problem you're trying to solve. So that's all I have to say about that. Now, in terms of syntax, for loop is very simple. Throw in the for keyword, of course, as usual, we're gonna need our parentheses and curly braces. And here, we're gonna have some code, and this is the code that will run a number of times. And in here, we'll have something. Right now, what this something is a little different than the things we've seen before, but it's not too complicated. So essentially, for loops, they're gonna have three basic elements. Okay, so the first one is the counter definition. So if you remember from my do while loops video, you remember that we declared a counter variable or an index variable that we would increment every time, right? So it's kind of the same thing here. The only difference is that we actually have the ability to define that counter or declare that counter in the loop itself. Okay, in the loop declaration. Okay, so how do we do that? We can actually say something like for int I, and I stands for index. It's kind of a pretty standard variable name when handling loops. Okay, and we have to say the number this counter is starting on. In this case, I'm gonna start this at 0. Okay, so for int I equals 0, and of course I is just an example. If I want to call it index, I can call it index. That's not a problem. If I want to call it counter, that's not a problem either. Okay, so I'm just gonna say I because it's fairly standard. So that's the first part. Okay, the second part is the condition, and we know what if statements are. We've worked with conditions before. We've done conditions with do while loops. So we're going to do the same thing here. So what condition should I establish for this loop? Okay, so I'm going to say something like I less than 10, for example. Okay, so this is the second part, the condition. And the third and last part is the increment, essentially saying how do I want my counter or my index variable to increment. For this example, I'm just gonna say I++. Okay, so that's a fairly standard for loop declaration. Okay, so you have a for loop, you have a counter or an index variable that will start at 0. This loop will run for as long as I is less than 10, and I is going to increment by 1 every time. Okay, and I'm gonna have some code here. I'm gonna replace that with a console write line, and I'm just gonna say I. And if I run this code, look at that. What I see is my counter variable starting at 0 and running 10 times. And why does it run 10 times? Because it's going to run for as long as I is less than 10, meaning less than or equal to 9. Okay, that's why 9 is my last number and not 10. Okay, so I can play around with these variables as well. So I'm incrementing my counter by 1 every time. So what if I want to increment it by 2? So I can actually do something like I plus equal 2. And if I run this, look at that, I'm actually incrementing my counter by 2 every single time. Okay, so it works for 3, 4, 5, works for any number. Okay, now the first thing I want to do is I want to put this knowledge into practice. And how do I do that? Well, I can actually come up with a problem, maybe problem with arrays, that I can use my for loop that I just learned to maybe create a random array. So let's try and do that. So the problem is create an array of size 10 populated with random numbers. Okay, just as an example. Now, because of my array is size 10, I can actually, keep that, because that will work. However, there might be a better solution. Okay, so this is an array exercise, so let's declare an array. So I want an array of integers, and I'm going to call this array, and I'm going to initialize it. And I know the size because the size is a given in this exercise. So I can just say 10. So at this point I have an empty array of size 10. And it's okay to hard code the 10 in here because I'm not collecting that from the user or anything like that. So this is just given by the exercise. So I don't have to worry about that. However, even though, as I said, this will work, there is a better way of doing this. I can just use the length property from my array. Array.length. Okay, so that way I don't have to worry if the array size changes in the future. Maybe I'm creating an array of random size. So I won't have to worry about all those moving parts if I'm calling array.length. I want my increment to be just 1, so I'm gonna go back to my I++. Now we have to change this a little, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say array. I'm gonna access my array elements through its index, and what I'm gonna have to do here is I'm going to generate a random number, and for that I'm gonna need a randomizer. So a randomizer is just a random type object. Okay, I just like to call it randomizer. And here I'll say that I want to call randomizer.next, and I want to generate a number between 0 and 9, for example. So this constraint is not given by the problem, so I'll just assume it's a number from 0 to 9 because that's easy to visualize. Okay, so I'm gonna do that, and if I run this code, I will generate my array, but I won't be able to see my array, right? So if I run this, you'll see that the console is actually empty. Okay, so I don't see anything there. Now I need to display my array to the user. Okay, so part A of the problem was create an array of size 10 populated with random numbers. Got a check mark. I've done that. Now part B is display the array. Okay, so as we said before, you cannot do a simple console write line statement and pass in your array as an argument and run this code and expect to see what those values are. Okay, so this will not give you the output you're looking for. Okay, so we're gonna have to do something a little better here. We're gonna have to do something a little more sophisticated. And last time, the way we solved this problem, I think we actually created a second loop, and we would just concatenate the array values into the output. We're gonna do something different now. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go back to my console write line. I'm gonna create an interpolated string. Okay, I'm gonna throw in a pair of square brackets. Let's say that my requirement is display the array in the following format. So it's gonna have a pair of square brackets, and I'm gonna have my first number, second number, third number, etc. Okay, so let's say this is the format I'm following. So I'm gonna throw in my square brackets in there. Now I'll have my placeholder, and in here I'm gonna do something fancy. Okay, I think it's a much better solution than just creating another loop and concatenating strings to it and all that kind of stuff that you already know. So what we're gonna do instead is we'll call the string.join method. Okay, and the string.join will essentially get an array, and it's going to join each element. It will kind of glue them together, put them in sequence back to back, right? And I actually have the ability to throw in a separator as the first parameter. And what the separator is the character or set of characters that will be placed in between each array element. Okay, so in this case, what I want to do is, it doesn't have to necessarily be a character, it can be a string as well. I will go with a string that is composed by comma space, because that's my format. In between each array element, I actually have a comma and a space, so it's not only a comma. Okay, so I have that. Now the second parameter is the array itself, the array that I'm working with. Okay, so it's there, fairly simple, just a one-liner, very straightforward. If I run this, look at that. That's a beautiful output. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So I have an array of 10 elements. I have random numbers for each one of those, and they're all separated by comma and space. And I don't have a comma space after the very last one, which was a problem that I had to solve, or at least it would be a problem that I would have to solve had I chosen to go with the string concatenation solution for this. So this was very simple, and from there are all kinds of problems that I can work now. If I want to do a mapping exercise, so for example, instead of displaying numbers into that array, maybe I want to display letters, random letters, right, from the alphabet. So that's very simple as well. I can just create an array to represent the alphabet, and instead of just populating my array, my char array, with random numbers, I can actually map each randomly generated number to a letter in my alphabet array. I mean, this is just one example. I can do the same thing with words if I want to pass in a dictionary of words, or at least a set of words that I can use in an array. I can do the same. So imagination is the only limit there. You can really do anything. Something that I have to say before wrapping up with this video is that 4 statements are pre-processed loops, and this is very important. And what that means is that it'll actually check if this condition is true before running this code. Okay, so this behavior is very different from the behavior we have in do while loops, because if you remember from my last video, the way do while loops work is that the code you have in the do block will always run at least once. Okay, and after it runs the first time, it'll actually check the condition for my loop, and if that condition is true, I'll run that code again. If it's false, then forget it, I won't run it the second time. Okay, that's the way do while loops work. For loops are different. Okay, so they'll actually check for the condition first. If the condition is true, then it'll run. And that is the difference between pre-processed loops, like for loops, and post-processed loops, like do while loops. Okay, and that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you learned something new today, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.